Symposium. We're also celebrating OkiJALT's 40th anniversary. We have a very special group of educators today, and we're looking forward to them. Our main guy, our keynote speaker, hardly needs any introduction. Dr. Andy Curtis has given workshops and been the keynote speaker and published in how many countries, Andy?
I've worked with teachers now in more than 100 countries.
More than 100 countries. So yeah, he's been in this game for a while, and he's helped so many people out along the way. And today he's going to start our symposium with his keynote address. So thank you so much, Dr. Curtis.
Thank you very much. Thank you, George. It's great to not quite be here. The question of where is here and where is there has gotten more interesting and more complicated in the last couple of years. But it is lovely to be here. As I was saying to the conference organizers before we started, this is a special event, OkiJALT's 40th anniversary, which is really a significant milestone. I thought I would ditch my usual suit and tie as Scott and I are on the beach on the program and go for something more beach-like. So this is a special event in many ways. As any of you who have organized an event like this, a one-day event can take a lot of people, a long time to put together. And because I've spent some time in other businesses and industries and professions, we think it's normal for a large group of people to spend a long time organizing an event for a day. And so my friends and family who are not in language education or education at all say, what would make it worth it? What would make all those people spending all that time for a one-day event? And I sometimes struggle to give them a good answer, but today for me, OkiJALT's 40th anniversary, the first time I've presented almost nearly on the beach, is what makes it worthwhile. So I did want to start by thanking all of the organizers, especially George McLean and Catherine Song, for all of the endless emails back and forth, pretty much up to the last minute, to make this a special event. One of the things that I have been practicing this year in particular, 2020 was a bit of a lost year for many of us. One of my favorite cartoons for 2020 was from the New York Times, and it's two dogs walking down the street, and one dog says to the other, wow, 2020, those were the 7 longest years of my life. So, of all the many COVID cartoons, that was one of my, because it felt like a long time. One of the things I've been asking people over that time is, what do you miss? What do you miss about going to conferences, like being there in person? And I must admit, nobody has said ever, oh, we really missed the slides. So I understand that slides are very helpful and very important, especially for audiences from several different language groups listening to a presentation in a language that is not their first. But I've been practicing, and again, I'm going to take some risks today because this is a place I feel safe, and these are people I know and trust, to try and do this without slides, but the chat box is going to get busy. So what I would, in some ways, normally put on a slide, because one of the problems with the slides, I've actually measured this because I'm such a geek, is that slides can occupy as much as 95% of the screen, and there's this tiny little thumbnail of the presenter. So I'm hoping everybody has access to the chat bar. I will leave time at the end for questions, but this is my first pop quiz to you. There are a number of events. I hope you can all see them, from the Kyoto Protocol to Toyota to the Japanese troops going to Iraq, Tokyo, Disneyland. So anyone is free to enter which year that all those things happened in Japan that year. Anyone want to type in? There were no wrong answers. Well, no, some answers are wrong, but you can type in whatever you think that year in all those things. 2000, close. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Don. So we're getting closer, if that's a clue. When I was a kid, we'd get like warmer and colder. So Don started the bidding at 2000. Jerry followed up with 2001. The year in which, yes, Grant, no, okay. No, Rab Patterson, thank you, 2003. But you were all kind of in there. And the reason that 2003 is the year I chose is because that was my 40th year, born 1963, 58 years of age, if you're doing the math. So 2003 was my 40th year. This is OkiJALT's 40th year. So I was reflecting, the theme of the conference is looking back and looking forward. I was thinking, what was I doing in my 40th year? So that's some of that to get us started. Now, why leadership? There were so many things that I could have chosen to reflect back and reflect forward on. And I chose leadership. And the reason for that is mainly because of what the COVID-19 worldwide pandemic has taught us about leadership. So this is a reference to an article that came out about a year ago, and 5 professors in 5 countries estimated who were the world's worst leaders, country leaders, in terms of the pandemic. So the second pop quiz, and Catherine may know this because we talked about this, why choose leadership when I could have chosen many other things? So any guesses as to who were, and it was quite an elaborate multi-country study with various parameters. Bojo, Trump, Bolsonaro, good calls. Let's see what these professors, and each professor was based in that country. So are you ready? There should be a roll on the drums somewhere. There probably is in Zoom, I just haven't found it. So Narendra Modi of India, Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. The one I wasn't expecting, but then I looked it up and it made sense, was Alexander Lukashenko from Belarus. Of course, our man, the 45th, and AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador of Mexico. So one of my points is that really for the first time in human history, it's not the first pandemic. We know that. There was the so-called Spanish flu. And I feel very bad because it wasn't Spanish and it wasn't flu. It was Spain actually were the ones who alerted the world to say, after the First World War, we think something's going on. And so sadly, it got labeled the Spanish flu, and it was neither Spanish, as Don said, could well have been born in the US. There were troops. Think about the Second World War, the end of the Second World War. In many ways, one of the largest human migrations of its time. So it wasn't Spanish, it wasn't flu, but politicians, and as linguists and language teachers, we need to be aware of this. When politicians endlessly talk about how unprecedented the pandemic was, they don't know what precedented means. Unprecedented. It's not unprecedented. Their mishandling of it is unprecedented. But the pandemic itself very much is not. In fact, the World Health Organization, there was a lot of talk about the twindemic. Did that phrase get to where you guys are? The twindemic? They were talking about two pandemics happening at the same time. Turns out there were a lot of pandemics. The twindemic referred to the massive campaign of misinformation. So they talked about the COVID-19 virus, coronavirus 2019, being one kind of pandemic, and the massive amount of potentially lethal misinformation being the twindemic. And now people talk about the tweendemic. And this is a bunch of us having fun with language, albeit in a rather dark humor. As a person of color, I've actually written about the fact that the Holy Bible contains over 100 references to lightness and dark. In every single one, lightness is goodness, and in every single one, darkness is badness, evil, really. So I'd be careful with the word dark, but as we're going dark, anyone, the tweendemic, yes, and I hope to get to David's presentation this afternoon. The tweendemic means that we are just in between pandemics. There is no post-pandemic. It's just not. We're not going to have a post-pandemic. In the same way, we're not going to have post-flu or post any of these things. So when I think about leaders, and I think about good leaders and poor leaders, and this is the first time in human history that we have the ultimate assessment of leadership. I would say that we have this opportunity, if it is an opportunity, and it would be remiss of me not to report on the current situation where many of you are. And according to various news agencies, that is the current situation. The leaders of Japan were not on the list, which is great. Somehow Boris Johnson avoided being on the list, but it was a very specific list. So it seemed appropriate to look at the situation. Much of the course was about context, and we may have some questions about how what I'm saying is very context dependent. So we've looked at 5 of the world's worst leaders, and between them, millions of people died. Now, it's one thing if you're a leader and you suck, and you hire the wrong person and you fire the wrong person, but we're living through a time in human history where poor leadership is actually costing millions of lives. And so I'm seeing discussions of leadership on a scale and scope that I've never seen before. For 30 years, I've been interested in leadership and writing and researching and making mistakes and trying to learn from them and trying to be a better leader. But I have never heard a global discussion of leadership as that which COVID has presented us. So you did very well with the 5 worst leaders for the pandemic. This is an article Andy Boone. Are you in New Zealand? She's kind of one of my heroes, and I know Scott Thornbury's there, and may be referring to. I've actually published articles on Elizabeth Arden's focus on empathy in leadership, and it helps being a small island far away, as you are, as Hawaii is. So Jacinda Ardern came up on the list of some of the world's leaders that were assessed to have led and managed their country well. And I agree with Rab's comment that it certainly helps if you're small. She talked about her 5 million, her team of 5 million. Who else? Anyone else want to throw their hat in the ring there and suggest who else might have been on the list of leaders that have so far, in general, done well with the ultimate leadership? I would say Angela Merkel. Yes. Oh, Joe Biden. Yeah, that's an interesting one, which because his predecessor and his okay, you guys did well. So you got Germany for Angela Merkel, you got Tsai Ing-wen from Taiwan, Jacinda Ardern. Some of the ones you notice, the Scandinavian countries, Katrin Jakobsdottir, and I love the way I've worked in Iceland, and Katrin Jakobsdottir means Katrin is the daughter of Jacob, because in many of our countries, you're used to Robinson and Peterson, and everybody's the son of somebody. But in the Icelandic language, if you're a daughter of somebody, that is marked in your name permanently. Sanna Marin from Finland, one of the youngest heads of state ever, I believe. Solberg in Norway, Mette Fredriksson. Notice anything? Compare the two lists for me for a moment and see if you notice any similarities or differences. Good. And the chat bar blows up. So it may be a coincidence. I'm not a real big fan of coincidence. And I'm very aware of context. I've written entire books on context. But yeah, the world's 5 officially researched worst leaders. And as I said, the death toll of, they used to call them, they have different names, but it basically means people who died who could have been saved, excess deaths. And again, as language teachers and language learners and linguists, the language is fascinating, right? Excess deaths, sometimes referred to in the media as preventable deaths. So all 5 countries on this side and all 6 countries on this side. And you know, some of them are small islands, obviously, New Zealand and Finland and Taiwan, but they're not all small islands. So the question of gender came up a lot in our course on leadership, partly because I have coined this rather grim phrase, but it's out there and you will be seeing it coming to a pointless publication near you soon, which is body bag leadership or body count leadership. There's nearly 100 years of literature where they still cannot decide, from the Harvard Business Review all the way back and forward and up and down, what is good leadership? And I proposed a model, partly mathematical, quantitative, qualitative, which says that if in India, my home country, your leader is lying by a factor of 1,000% on the death toll, 400,000 is the official death toll, 3 to 4 million dead Indians. because Modi handled it badly. So I'm putting this out there. I'll be writing and publishing. We have, again, for the first time in human history, the ultimate measure of leadership. Lots and lots of dead people, mass graveyards, poor leadership. Very few dead people, good leadership. And I know people in the overpriced elite MBA world who challenge me on this, but that's because they're in the overpriced MBA world, so I don't really pay attention. But the point is, it's part of the industry of the MBA to have these big discussions on what is good leadership, what is bad leadership. Lots of dead people, bad leadership. Lots of people, lives saved, good leadership. So this is trying to set this whole notion of leadership in a broader context. And when people say to me, why do you get so intense about this stuff? A, because I had an unhappy childhood, and B, because this stuff really matters to me. So bringing all of that, the politics and the practices of leadership internationally and in language education, there is a book coming out, January, we hope, called Reflecting on Leadership in Language Education from Equinox Publishers. They have not sponsored this talk, although now that I think about it, they probably should have. It's the first book, as far as we know, ever, to gather 300 years of lived leadership in language education experience. You may recognize many of those names as past presidents of TESOL International, of Ioc. There are people on the board of TESOL. We have the executive director of TESOL. So the reviews of the book said that this was the first time ever that someone had brought together this many years of lived experience of leadership under a single book. And that's always lovely. Many of you are in publishing and publish books, and it's lovely to get a reviewer to say, yes, definitely publish this. We've never seen anything like this. But for me, it was also troubling because I couldn't figure out why. Many of you that I can see in your thumbnails are in leadership roles and have been for a while or are going to be. And I asked a couple of the students who couldn't attend our Friday night 90-minute lecture as a makeup assignment to pour through the literature and see what was the ratio. And what they found was for every 100 and something books on technology and methodology and even the politics and the materials of language, foreign language education, there was fewer than one. That's how they put it. And I love that, fewer than one. I don't know if it's is fewer than one, are fewer than one. The point is that in our field, in foreign language education, I don't say second because that term came from native speakers of English as a first. It's not second or foreign language education. Most of the world is multilingual, so it's not a second language. One of my students recently, English was their 9th language. So for we as a community publish 100 times more stuff on methodology, on technology, on the post-colonial positioning of English, which is my thing, than we do on leadership. Why would we be in a situation where we're publishing 100 times more in this area than we are in this area? And through the course and through my own research and data, it's a staggering amount of teachers who were in leadership roles, more than 90% of them said, we never had any leadership training. And you got to wonder, because most countries and most schools wouldn't let you near a classroom, a room full of kids with no training and no ongoing teacher professional development. Yet in leadership, we're like, okay, I guess you'll do good. You were good in the classroom. You'll just pick it up as it goes along. So there's this massive, fascinating disconnect between what we demand of people in our field as language educators. We are mercifully long past the tall, thin, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white American male in Japan who'd be, you know, fine in America or in England or in Canada, but they're enjoying a good life mainly because of their native speaker history and their appearance. We're past that, but we don't seem to be past the notion that anybody can lead. All of us on this call, on this conference, will vigorously reject the claim that just knowing a language is enough to teach it. We know that's bollocks. We will vigorously reject the claim that native speakers of a language are the best person to teach it. Also bollocks. But we haven't yet gotten to the stage where we say anybody in leadership in foreign language education should have extensive training and lifetime ongoing professional development. And if you have any answers as to why we have this terrible dichotomy, but then we complain about poor leadership and poor management in language education. So this is where I am now in my research, thanks to Catherine and the other 13 course participants. Rab Patson asked the question, have they books on 300 years in other fields? Yeah, they have. They're not very good, and they're certainly not as good as ours, but I'm it's called Leadership Now. If you want to sign up to it, it's free. It's kind of annoying, but it's free. And Leadership Now shows that every 3 days, a book on leadership comes out from the US. Just the US. More than 100 books a year on leadership. And they're mostly from guys, you know, Coca-Cola and GM, and there's a particular demographic, and they write about how incredibly skilled and gifted they were, and how the company made a load of money. Now, if they're lucky, the book will be published before the stock tanks, because that has happened. We saw with the mayor of New York, who initially did a wonderful job of challenging the president and published a book on leadership, and then fell down in some horrible scandals. So you've got to get the timing right. But to go back to abstracts, there's a lot of books on leadership, but it's a good question, because 3 centuries in one book, there are those in other fields. But now that you mention it, most of the leadership literature from corporate America, which is where most of the books are coming from, 100 books a year, are about a older, whiter American male in charge of making cars or cookies or whatever the hell it is, writing a book, ignoring their own privileges, and conveniently assuming that they're just better than everyone else. That's why their company did something. It's called the great man theory or the natural order. And natural order has been very big in the far right in the US. So probably not a great leadership theory. And what I've seen is people in language education who are so desperate for decent material, going to the darkish side and screwing it up, because the models of leadership in the car industry, in the cookie industry, don't apply to our field. So there's this interesting misalignment that in language education, foreign language education, because we have nothing, we have so few books to refer to and published articles, we end up going to corporate America, and that's a mistake. That's a mistake for America, but it's certainly a mistake for language education. So before we go to questions, having set leadership in the broader context, explained my reasons for interest in this topic, which is an ongoing interest, but since the pandemic, it's grown considerably. So I've posted a couple of details there. It's an online doctorate that I'm going to be talking about. Leadership in Management. We have 14 participants. The course is wrapping up now. I was marking papers until very shortly before this conference began. It so happens that most of the people on the course are in Japan. And we have 5 men, 3 women, 2 male course participants from the US, 1 female course participant from South Korea, and the other 5 are born and raised and living and working in Japan. And rereading their posts today, 2 of the recurring themes, which came out very strongly because of the way I teach, which is to say obsessive compulsively, we have well over 100,000 words of posted discussion. It's an 8-week course. Do not take any of my courses. It's an 8-week course on leadership in language education, doctoral level, 100,000 words and over 500 postings. It gets mad intense in a good way. I just heard from someone who got a major promotion today, which and she's crediting part of that to this course. So that really does make it kind of all worthwhile. And 2 themes came out very strongly amongst the 8 of 14 participants was women in leadership in language education roles in Japan, and which is really interesting with the Olympics going on, this perceived lack of ethnic or racial diversity in Japan, this perceived relative ethnic racial homogeneity. So I'm not going to get into that now, but if you have any questions about that in relation to leadership. So those were the 2 recurring themes, and Catherine can correct me. So I'm going to start wrapping up so that there's time for questions with a very, this was in some ways a groundbreaking course. We didn't have a textbook because there aren't any. There were no really good recent textbooks on leadership in language education. So Anaheim, which I appreciated, allowed me to create a new course from scratch with no textbook. And based on a series of readings, these were some of the course objectives. Distinguishing between management and leadership, there is some overlap, but they are clearly not the same. The whole question of context, which has been a big part of what we've been talking about. Equity and social justice. Some course participants really warmed to those topics, and in leadership in language education, some course participants felt offended that we would be discussing those. They wanted to know where were the spreadsheets for budgeting. Those are, it was insanely ambitious to try and cover this many objectives in this. I don't know why Anaheim University does this. These courses could be 12 or 16 weeks, but if you're going to allow people to get a doctoral degree in as little as 2 years. I guess you've got to keep the pace up. So those were some of the other course objectives, which I think we actually did surprisingly well. The Scholar Practitioner Framework, Teacher Leadership and TPD, Sex and Gender in relation to LEL, Theories and Practices, Dominant versus Minority Understandings, because so much of the literature on leadership is coming out from what we would call English dominant cultures, Raj Kachru's inner circle of the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and so on. So I deliberately set readings, and the course participants were very cool about reading about Islamic approaches to leadership, for example. Something called executive loneliness. Leadership can be very lonely. Professional standards, the role of empathy, authenticity, and then 2 research projects. So that's a very brief summary of where I think we should be looking back over the last 40 years, but especially looking forward to the next 40 years. What will leadership look like in language education? What will leadership in OkiJALT, in Big JALT, in the TESOL International Association, in IATEFL? When I was elected to be the 50th president of TESOL International in 2015, I was the first president in 50 years of Indian origin. I was the first president from the Afro-Caribbean Pacific. I was certainly the first brown president. I was one of the very few presidents ever to not have been born and raised and living and working in the US. I was one of the very few over 50 years who was born and raised in England, who was living and working in Canada. So the association, TESOL International, of which JALT is, of course, an affiliate, in the last 10 years, I guess, the last 10 to 12 years, there's been more diversity in leadership, which we alluded to in the last 12 years than there has been in the previous 40. So I hope that explains some of the work I've been doing, my very heartfelt interest in this area in our field, the troubling gaps in the literature, and this really serious, urgent need to be looking at the next generation of leaders in JALT, in the chapters of JALT, in the associations, and in foreign language education at large. For people like me, I'm good, I'm done, you know. I became a grandfather last month. The most important work I'm going to do in my life, I've done. So now I spend an enormous amount of my time and energy working with people who've never published before on their first publication, which is pretty cool, on people who never imagined they'd be in a leadership role, coaching and mentoring them to be leaders. So that's my 40 years back and 20 years forward. I'll wrap that up there. And if anyone has questions, I've been following the chat bar. It's a different skill as a presenter, isn't it? Like following the chat bar, typing into the chat bar, paying attention. That's why I don't do slides. I don't think I could do slides as well as all of this. So there's, I believe, and George will let us know if I'm wrong, but I believe we have some time for questions. I'd love to hear them if you have them.
We do indeed have time, Andy. So you can either maybe if people could type their questions in the chat, that would be great.
Yes.
I'm also looking for people to raise their hands if they want to ask the question directly.
Yes. Yes, I'm looking at Don's comment. Yeah, this business, and I'm glad you picked up on that. People like Naomi Osaka and others who have said, we're not doing interviews because the questions are inappropriate. I think this could be a more important Olympics in ways that people haven't imagined, in the ways that we idolize and tear down our athletes, in the ways that diversity, the BBC and other, what I call reliable news agencies as opposed to Fox, have been running big articles on how the Olympics might change notions of diversity in Japan. This is, for me, very exciting. And, you know, I became an academic because I wasn't good at sports, as many of us do. If I wanted to be, if I was good at cricket, but that's not really a sport. When I realized I was going to suck at all the other sports, I'm like, well, get a PhD and stay home where you can't do any damage. So any questions about anything I've said, which I realize is a lot? I'm just going to enjoy seeing everybody and reading all of your posts. I'm not sure if Elka Todeva is here, but it's great to see you.
Dr. Curtis, we have a question from Maruka Nagado.
Great.
Sorry, there was a little bit of a typo in my comment. I'm sorry, but I just want to basically, and thank you so much. That was, yeah, I've never, like a lot of new idea I've ever even thought of. So I thank you so much. I was particularly interested in the relatively new idea of authentic leadership. Yes. Because I never thought of leadership in that way, like authentic or so I wonder, it's a really simple question, I would say, but what's the opposite of like authentic leadership? And I assume authentic leadership is like a new direction we could look for. So that was my understanding of it. So I'd really appreciate it if you could elaborate on a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Korsan. And it's, as with all great questions, it kind of looks simple, but it's actually not. The opposite, of course, as language teachers, we're going to say, what's the opposite of inauthentic leadership? And then the question is, so what's the inauthentic leadership? This was something I came across in my research in preparing this brand new course, and I don't mind admitting, as we're a smaller group of friends here, that it wasn't on my radar. It was something that came up in my reading to prepare a new course, and once I started reading about it, I realized there was a lot of stuff. So the short answer, and if you go to Google Scholar and type authentic leadership, there's a lot of cool stuff there. The difference between authentic and inauthentic leadership is the kind of leader is to do with internal and external awareness. So in motivation, we're familiar with the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. But there's this interesting layer that says, how aware are you as a leader of how people see you as a leader? And when you write down the things that you believe in as a leader, and then you write down all the things you did that day, your thoughts and beliefs versus your words and actions, do they match? And in most cases, they don't, for normal, natural human reasons. But I really appreciate the question, because it's something that was honestly a bit new to me, but I've become very interested in it. Authentic is just a label, of course, but the idea is to do with awareness of oneself as a leader, awareness of others, of awareness of how we see the people who report to us, and awareness of how they might see us. So I sort of picture it as a 4-part grid in a way, but it's to do with levels of awareness and the gap between why we became a leader and what we actually do as a leader. So, you know, let's say equity and social justice. We believe, some leaders believe that's why they became leaders, but they find themselves in all kinds of political compromises regarding equity and social justice and transparency. So it's not good or bad. Authentic leadership isn't good or bad, but it's a way of measuring awareness and the relationship between what you believe as a leader and what you do and say as a leader. Does that answer the question, Madam Ko? Thank you.
Dr. Curtis, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the role of empathy in leadership.
Yeah. Again, thank you very much, Don, for that question. The interesting, for me, the interesting thing was, it didn't occur to me that empathy was a bad thing. And one of our course participants alerted me to a book called Against Empathy. Now, when I look at it, it's basically an academic who's, and I envy these people. I mean, I don't like them, but I envy them. So you take something that is generally considered to be good, like love or joy or bliss or empathy, and then you say it's bad. And then you write a whole book of 300 pages with 300 footnotes and get yourself a big ass grant from the US government. When you read the book called Against Empathy, what the guy is in favor of is compassion. I'm like, wait, what? You're telling me, as a best-selling academic, if there is such a thing, the whole notion of public intellectuals is pretty dodgy after Jordan Peterson. Most people wouldn't distinguish between empathy and compassion. But we had this really interesting argument because we had this one guy on the course who was just angry at empathy. He was just like really, he just really took it upon himself to catalog the evils of empathy. And we're like, okay, maybe some therapy, I don't know. But the point of empathy isn't that controversial. It's that, and this is interesting as language teachers, right? The difference between sympathy and empathy. Anyone brave enough to have a go? So you're in class and one of your students says, please, teacher, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy? The reason that empathy has become a big thing in leadership, I think, is because a lot of the leadership literature was results-based and outcomes-oriented. And what we're discovering, especially if we look at the earlier examples I gave you of the countries that have done very well with the pandemic and the countries that have done very badly, is that empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is, oh, I know how you must feel. I can imagine how you must feel. That must feel terrible. Sympathy. Empathy is, I have gone through the experience that you are going through, and I'm not going to say that I'm experiencing it the same way, but I am not just able to sympathize, I'm able to empathize. So when someone comes to you as a leader and they're just having a really bad day, and it's nothing to do with their job, the babysitter's cancelled, someone's filed for divorce, someone's turned up from the bank to repossess your home. When people are having a bad day, if you have a lot of empathy, you're able to listen to them we talk about active listening in language education, right? And that's why I think most language educators are good at empathy, because empathetic listening means do not listen to just the words. Anyone can do that. But in between the words, there are emotions. So listen for what is not being said. When you can hear what is not being said, then you're in a place that most people don't get to. And certainly most leaders with a busy day and someone comes into their office will never get to. But I've seen it and I'm kind of learning to do it. And it's transformative. There's a lot of talk of transformative leadership. The most transformative leadership is to be able to feel and hear what is not being expressed and said. That's empathy. And the leaders who can do that I've had the pleasure and privilege and honor of seeing, they're transformative. Because the person just needed to feel that someone was hearing them in a way they hadn't been heard. So they come into your office and they're upset about something, but it's not that, it's never that. It's what that represents. So that's why I would say empathy together with authentic leadership, both of which are relatively new in leadership. Authentic leadership and empathetic leadership are relatively new, but I can see those being very big and very important areas in the future. Sorry for the long answer.
Brad.
Hey, I just kind of lost my connection there, so I'm back in now. A couple of quick points. One was just a quick reaction to something that Andy said, and then an actual something that I want his reaction to. The first one, as a Scot, of course, I would 100% disagree that the BBC is in any way reliable. They're only reliable to take the BBC's position, which doesn't mean it's reliable in terms of providing a neutral, balanced view of the news, which of course is supposed to be their remit. So I would 100% disagree with that. That aside, this media aspect and public relations of things is very, very important for how leadership is portrayed. You know, I'm just looking at the Olympics now and the issues you've brought up about leadership, COVID, etc. And so many people don't seem to be aware of the horrible history behind the IOC's leadership. For example, we've had Samaranch, who was a fascist from Spain, gifting the leadership to his family, etc. And so many people are just not aware of this at all. And I just wonder how much, whether people are perceived as being good or bad leaders, authentic or inauthentic, effective, ineffective, is related to the PR that the leaders actually have. If you could maybe make a comment on that.
Oh yeah, for sure. And thank you. And I will agree with you. The CBC here in Canada comes out of the BBC. And let's not forget that the BBC was in its origins called the Empire Service. It wasn't always the British Broadcasting Service. You do the history, it was the Empire Service. So it's a very particular view. And especially during the pandemic, people in my social circle, we don't listen to the BBC for news, and we don't listen to the CBC for news because they're government-funded agencies. So of course they're going to be under pressure to present a particular point of view. So we listen to them for other programs in a way. But you're absolutely right to challenge me 100% on the relative truthfulness. But what I have written and published on is the fact that if you want to know about what's happening in your country where you are, don't look at the national news agency. So when I want to get a take on what's happening in Britain, I don't go to the BBC, I go to Al Jazeera, for example, or I'll go to some American news agencies, CNBC. So that's my main point, is that you have to see how another news agency is looking at your country if you want to understand them. the question about the IOC and corruption, this is being recorded, oh, good. The question about IOC and corruption, yeah, I would say, and I would, as you know, Ram, I would encourage everybody who is interested, I mean, really interested in leadership and management as it relates to the Olympics, to look at the history of the IOC. It's a little bit of a case study. I imagine it is a case study in some overpriced elite MBAs as to the scale and scope of, let's say, moral, ethical compromise in terms of leadership. There's the C word, corruption, as defined in different ways, I notice. But yeah, as the Olympics is happening there and all over the world, countries are saying, why is it happening? It's happening because of the money involved. It's happening because a very small number of people are going to get very rich from the Olympics, not just in Japan, but wherever they happen. Wherever they happen, this is well documented. A small number of people who are already rich get richer when the Olympics comes. The vast majority of people are just vastly inconvenienced and never see the benefits. So I'm afraid the IOC is a bit of a case study in, let's call it, morally, ethically compromised leadership. I know we have to get going soon for the next talk, but I'm happy to hang around for another few minutes as it's the early hours of the morning here, so I don't know how much longer I'll be able to be with you.
David has a question.
I had a question about, and maybe we'd like to talk about it later or in your sleep. What do you think of the role of the visionary in leadership in EFL or just in leadership?
Yeah, and I think I saw that in the posting maybe. So yes, there you go. What do you think of the role of visionary leadership? It's a great question, and I always teach my students, when you don't have a great answer, always compliment the question, because it gives you time. It's like, it's a great question. I'm so glad you asked that. You're like, I don't know, but it gives you time to think. And the other thing is, of course, truly, the better the question, and this is a good one, the longer the answer, which we generally don't have time for. But it has come up, and I appreciate it coming up, because for me, visionary is, of course, a highly emotive word, and means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for me, I've been lucky enough to have a few real epiphanies. In the Pirates of the Caribbean, I think one of the characters said that he just had an apostrophe when he meant he just had an epiphany, which is lovely. And it was me watching leaders see in other people things that they did not yet see in themselves in terms of leadership potential. And those are moments I don't think I'll forget, because for me, what a visionary leader is not a futurist, or even more offensively, a futurologist. It's someone who can envision the person in front of them in ways that they do not yet see themselves. And that's really, I had people do that with me, I realized. I didn't realize it at the time. And through the mentoring and coaching programs I've been involved with for 20 years, and some of those people are on this call, I've seen in them potential as leaders and teachers and curriculum development specialists, as writers and researchers and speakers and authors. I've seen in them glimpses of things that they are not yet ready to see in themselves. So when I talk about myself wanting to be visionary, it is envisioning in them things they do not yet see. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it relates actually too. I was going to ask about, I mean, how much leadership do you think can be taught?
Ooh. Oh, yes. Well, I see our time is up. No, it's so many good questions. Okay, think of a short answer to a really good question. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with, which came up on the course, the nature-nurture debate. I definitely do not buy a lot of the literature from a very specific demographic that says we were born to be leaders. No, you were born with a silver spoon up your ass. That's why, because you got so much privilege you don't even see it. That's why. So the leadership born into it, no, you don't have to do much research to discover that some of the world's greatest leaders. And to be fair, on the course at Anaheim, I had people, one person in particular, who insisted that Hitler was, and I quote, a great leader. And so that was an interesting and delicate discussion of greatness. So I think nature, nurture, we said it was all nature, and then we said it's all nurture. Now we're somewhere in between, and we say that people are born with a set of potential knowledge, skills, and abilities. And if they're in an environment that's conducive to that, then those potentials will be realized. So I vigorously reject inborn talent, unless we're talking about maybe Olympic athletes. But I do very strongly subscribe to the idea that that potential to be a homicidal, genocidal, psychopathic leader is in all of us, but within all of us is the ability to be an inspiring and kind and compassionate leader who will change the world for the better. It's all in us. We're born with it. It depends on which of those potentials are realized by the people around us.
Thank you. It was really sneaky of me to ask you that question with so little time left.
It's a great question.
Ladies and gentlemen, your last chance for now.
Yeah, I can, there's a thunderstorm outside and it's the early hours of the morning, so I'm just going to pour a glass of good whiskey there, Rab, and probably try and stay up till 5 a.m., which is when Scott is coming and the closing ceremony, but I may have passed out before then. I've done something I don't do. I've posted my email because I've really enjoyed this discussion enormously and wanted to give people the chance to follow up. And if anyone wants the last question, I'm good for that. But I also am very respectful of the next presentations and the next speakers.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Curtis. We really appreciate your being with us today and taking the time out, pulling an all-nighter, so to speak, really. And that's just amazing. For our attendees, for our participants, one of the things I'd like to mention is that we have some chill out rooms. So basically, we have 3 rooms with presentations going on, 3 at the most, usually 2. But when you're done your session, if there are people that you want to continue your discussion with, presenters, then go to your chill out room. So for example, if your presentation is in room 1, when you're done, if you still want to continue the discussion, please go to chill out room 1. And there's a general chill out room if you just want to socialize, please be there, as well as a keynote room, which is, it's our VIP room, but you're welcome there anytime, Andy.
I'm like I say, I'm wired at this point, so I don't know how to get to the chill out room, but I'm available if anyone wanted to chill, because it's going to take me a while to wind down. So
Well, actually, we're going to have a 15-minute break at this point in time, and then yeah, it's a good point for all participants. Anne, my co-chair, Anne, are you here? She's much better at explaining these things than me, but basically, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a square on the right-hand side of there's a green button in the center, and on the right-hand side, there should be a square that says breakout rooms. If you're using the latest version of Zoom, you should be able to choose whatever room you want to go to from there, if I'm not mistaken, right? So you could go to room 1 for the next session, or room 2. I think we have a few sessions where there's actually 3 concurrent sessions going on, but not too many.
If you're a Mac user, when you open that box up and you'll see the list of rooms, you don't actually see a join button. You'll see a number for the number of people in each room. And Mac users, if you hover over the number changes to a join button.
Yeah, it does.
Also, one other thing I would like to add is that that one of the sponsors, Sponge ELT, has its own breakout room, and please, if you have any questions or just want to know what Sponge, and the person who is responsible, his name is Bob. Seriously, it's Bob. His name is Robert, so Bob. So go and ask, go there if you have any questions about the products that he is selling.
Sorry,
Yeah,
yes. One other thing that's rather important, I neglected to mention. Dr. Curtis's talk today was about leadership, and here's an example of someone putting their money where their mouth is. Dr. Curtis has donated his honorarium to sponsoring 4 student JALT memberships for 1 year. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Curtis.